Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. Welcome to this affordable housing webinar hosted by the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. Our focus today is on state measures to improve affordable housing access. Opening remarks will be delivered by Peggy Bailey, who is Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She's also a former senior advisor at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We'll then have a panel discussion moderated by Charles Ellison, policy consultant for CSG's Council on Communities of Color. Joining Peggy and Charles on this panel, we have Senator Russell Huxtable, a member of Delaware's Housing and Land Use Committee, who also served on the Governor's Council on Housing. And joining us very soon, we will have Representative Jeff Luxembourg, Chair of the Housing Committee for the Connecticut General Assembly. Thank you to everyone who's here attending today. Thank you to our panelists and our moderator. Peggy, whenever you're ready, I'd like to now hand over the floor for your opening remarks.
Hi, thanks, Joseph, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm so excited that you're covering this really important topic. As state leaders across the Northeast, your work every day to ensure that every one of your constituents, no matter who they are, has a safe, stable place to live is so important, and that they don't have to choose between paying the rent and having enough food on the table. But you also know that unfortunately that's far from the reality for too many of the people that you represent. Rents have increased at staggering rates across the country, but particularly in the states you all represent. At the same time, incomes have only gone up slightly, and they have not gone up anywhere close to closing the gap between incomes for renters and the increases we've seen in recent years. This has resulted in leaving about 8 million people nationwide, maybe even more, with low incomes paying more than 50% of their income on rent. That's 8 million people teetering on the edge of eviction, on the edge of homelessness, or maybe they're able to stay housed, but it's barely. One small crisis event, one small health illness, which could result in them not having enough hours at work that week. Even just a small spike that we've seen in gas or food prices can upset their ability to afford their home. And unfortunately, federal programs like rental assistance aren't keeping up. They can help when someone wins the lottery and gets them, but they only reach about 1 in 4 people who need it because federal funding is not nearly enough. And this isn't a result of millions of people simply making poor personal choices in life. It's a result of poor policy choices made over decades. If we learn anything from the pandemic, increases to the child tax credit, being able to prevent evictions, the emergency housing vouchers, through all of that, we showed that we can impact poverty. We can keep people housed. So it's definitely a policy choice that we're not doing it at the federal level. When it comes to housing, many of those policy choices can be at least mitigated at the state and local level. Policies that can reverse redlining and improve residential integration, that direct resources to affordable housing and community development, thinking about helping ease the capital costs that it takes to build affordable housing. And many of these ways to influence can improve and reverse some of the racist and discriminatory practices that have led to too many communities of color, especially Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, have high housing cost burden, face eviction and homelessness at disproportional rates to their white peers. The good news is that as state policymakers, you are uniquely situated to directly address some of these issues and to make different policy choices that have been made in the past and chart a better path and more just path moving forward. And even though it's hard, because I know you have state budgets that have to be balanced, I'm going to push you to kind of think first and foremost, outside of the scarcity, the pie is only so big mindset, because once we can think outside of that, we can come up with creative solutions, and then we re-enter into reality of like, okay, well, how can we make progress on those solutions given some of the constraints at hand? And in order to think outside the box, it's important to center the people that you're trying to help, and what kinds of policies and public investments get us closer to helping those people moving forward. But again, it's going to take some creativity on all of our parts to start to show that example that you all are at the state level, so that the federal government does a better job of stepping up to the plate. And indeed, what we know from across the country, and as I said, particularly because of what we learned during the pandemic, that there are tools that we can use to address the affordable housing crisis. So what are some of those mechanisms? What are some of the things that we can do? This isn't an exhaustive list, but there are things that we can do to protect vulnerable renters and boost affordable housing supply, and also get more rental assistance to people. And some of my colleagues are in the audience, and they'll be putting in some pieces in the chat. And we have a new resource that we developed with the National Low Income Housing Coalition that could be that can show you what many of the states are doing in some of these spaces. But I'll go through a few. So going back to this mismatch between skyrocketing rents and lackluster incomes, we know that a huge portion of families, because of stagnant wages, but also for people with disabilities or older adults who have fixed incomes, they simply can't afford market rate housing. You know, it's important. Sometimes we think that we can educate or train our way out of poverty, and that's not entirely the case. We have to remember that, you know, people are paid what their employers choose to pay them. And so what people make isn't entirely up to them, and is largely not up to them. And so thinking about thinking about how to close that gap from incomes and rents, there's just going to be a need for rental housing, for a rental subsidy in order to close that gap, so that people only have to pay 30% of their incomes on rent. And we also and it's also important to remember that we can't build housing for zero cost, right? That's part of the reason we've run into the issues with public housing, is that while rents may be zero, we're not paying enough to to operate or maintain those buildings. So if rent is the best way to make sure we're at least providing enough resources to properly maintain and operate buildings, then there's just going to be a group of people that we need to supplement their income to do that. And there are states that are doing this, including states in the Northeast, New Jersey and Connecticut, and New York is considering more rental assistance, preventing evictions and people sliding into homelessness by expanding tenant-based protections, and providing emergency rental assistance is another area that can have impact. Again, we learned this lesson during the pandemic with the emergency rental assistance program, that this can work. And so finding ways with state and local resources to keep those programs moving along is critically important. States can also play a role in increasing affordable housing supply, talking to developers about how difficult it is to put together the capital stack for financing, even when you're using the low-income housing tax credit, and finding ways to get developers resources that are accompanied with the low-income housing tax credit faster can help decrease the debt that developers have to carry and expedite affordable housing coming online, which can result in lower rents for some. But I want to make sure it's clear that that still means that rental subsidy will be needed for others at the lowest income in order to make sure those properties are properly maintained. Other issues in supply include addressing zoning laws, and this is a place where many of you could be examples for some of your peers from across the country, where you've advanced inclusionary zoning laws, but other states are preemptively trying to block those efforts. And so helping your colleagues or your peers in the South in particular, and other states, understand the benefits of inclusionary zoning would be fantastic. And also ways to addressing the burdensome administrative review processes is another piece of the supply puzzle. But overall, it's important that with all of these policies to keep a focus on how to help those with the least be able to afford housing. Looking at while there is a push for housing for people in the middle, like teachers and police officers and healthcare workers, which is vitally important, understanding that's the same supply that we need to help low-income folks be able to subsidize to also ensure their ability to afford housing and stay stably housed. So I'm really excited about participating on the panel today, and again, the council for having this session is so important, and being able to take the examples that you all are working on and taking them to the federal level is what we'll need to be able to eventually solve this affordable housing crisis. That, Joseph, and so Charles, I will pass it to you.
All right, Peggy, the great research that you provided us as well definitely would encourage our viewers to go over to the chat. You see the chat room right there. There's a graphic that our communications person, Dylan McDowell, provided in the chat. Check that out. You can click on it. It'll take you to Peggy's X page, and you can see the graphic. You can see how, as what she was describing just now in her presentation, also there's the database from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition that can go a little bit deeper into this topic as well. I'm Charles Ellison. I'm your moderator for today. Also, I'm a policy consultant who is the director of the Council on Communities of Color for the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. So we have two of our panelists here with us today. So we'll probably have our third panelist joining us hopefully very shortly. So definitely appreciate Joseph putting this discussion together, and definitely looking forward to some more insights. I'm going to start off with you, Senator Huxtable. Senator Russell Huxtable is joining us. He is a member of the Delaware General Assembly. He also sits on the Housing and Land Use Committee. So he has quite a bit of background in this issue. And you've spent about 2 decades working in affordable housing, to my understanding, Senator Huxtable. So what's keeping you up at night? Like, what aspect of this issue is keeping you up the most at night right now?
It's a good question. There's certainly a need for affordable housing. And I know I spent 2.5 decades working for nonprofits doing affordable housing and community development work. And I originally got involved because I loved helping that person who needed that opportunity for something warmer, safer, drier, and more affordable. But now as I've switched roles and now in the General Assembly, I think what keeps me up at night is knowing that there are constituents out there that obviously need this housing, but then it's the other folks in our communities who need them to have this housing and this stability, because they are the people who are working in our stores, in our restaurants, and our healthcare system. And we are seeing capacity issues all around in a lot of crucial economic markets. And I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of affordable housing, because if people can't afford to live where they work, I mean, they'll go elsewhere. They'll find some place where it's cheaper to work and to live. And in my district, where you have the median home price near $500,000, and countywide, and you have rents at $1,800, where are those folks who are serving in our communities going to serve? And then that impacts everybody, even down to the person who might, need that EKG, that heart issue, and they get pushed off 2 or 3 months to get that service because there's just not enough staff people around. So I think that's what keeps me up at night, just knowing that we are out of balance in our communities.
Just continue on with that discussion too, Senator, and I'll get to you in a short few moments, Peggy. I'm real curious as well, like how we know that affordable housing policymakers, legislators know that affordable housing is a big problem, right? And that lack of affordable housing can be, just the way you framed it, can be a drag on a city or a state's or a region's economy, right? Because the more that individuals, that families are paying for rent or for housing, is less money that's flowing into the economy. Why are we having so many problems finding practical or effective solutions to it?
Well, probably for a few reasons. We just haven't been making, as Peggy was mentioning before, we just haven't been making the investments in affordable housing, thinking that the market's going to take care of itself. There's a demand, right? There is a huge demand in our area for houses under $200,000, rental properties at $800 or $900. Huge demand. But the market's not supplying it. Why? Because there's also a huge demand for those $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 houses. And so there is a market failure in that regard. The federal government used to invest about $1 billion in a program through the USDA, Department of Agriculture, to develop rural rental housing. That was in the late 70s, early 80s. And that program now probably sits at about $30 million annually. So we went from $1 billion to 30 million because we've shifted gears into the low-income housing tax credit program, which still needs significant, because of the cost to build, still needs significant direct investments. And we just haven't been making that on the federal level. So states are going to need to come up with solutions to bring additional resources to the table to encourage and entice those developers to build.
Real quick, Senator, as well, can you talk about recent legislation that you've been working on that you feel will improve housing affordability in your state right now?
Sure. We just passed a bill that encourages local investments from our towns and our counties to invest some of the ARPA dollars, American Recovery Plan Act dollars, or other revenue that they may have. And if those towns and jurisdictions invest in affordable housing, the state's going to waive the realty transfer tax fees. So we're trying to lower the cost on the housing that's to be developed, and at the same time encourage investments from others, not just the state and federal, but even the local communities who know this housing issue probably more, or should know this housing issue more profoundly than the state or the federal government, because it's happening in these communities.
I do see we have Connecticut State Representative Jeff Luxembourg. He's also joined us. He's the chair of the Housing Committee for the Connecticut General Assembly. Welcome, Representative Luxembourg. So I'm just going to jump in with a couple of questions for you. If you can lay out for us or define for us some of those challenges that Connecticut is facing in terms of affordable housing. And so when people think of a state like Connecticut, they immediately think, let's just sort of be real here, they immediately think affluent, but Connecticut is dealing with affordable housing issues, right? Especially being in a state next door to New York City, a part of metropolitan New York, parts of it. So talk about those challenges.
Yeah, well, gosh, you hit the nail on the head. We actually just had our first significant population increase in Connecticut, over 57,000 added to our population. And the vast majority of those folks that moved into Connecticut actually came from New York. And yet geographically, we are a very small state. So we don't have a lot of land, and the land cost in some cases is very high. the challenge with Connecticut is, as I think your question alluded to, is we have incredible gaps in opportunity for the people in this state. We admittedly, yes, we have some of the wealthiest people in the world in Fairfield County, and yet if you look at the poverty rates in some of our cities and towns in Connecticut, we have some of the most vexatious challenges in the country. And the disparity between those two things is so stark because it's often just a few blocks away from the incredible wealth. So we have some of the most segregated housing in the country. We have some of the most racially isolated communities in many ways. We have really, really vexatious zoning restrictions that are put in place locally to block the production of housing, and specifically to block the production of affordable housing. And we have in a nation where I think the average is something like you have 5 new building permits out of every 1,000 households in terms of housing production. Connecticut is something like 1 out of 1,000. So it shows you just how much, in some ways, we're struggling with overcoming a lot of unique barriers to produce affordable housing. Some of them are, frankly, institutional racism and not in my backyard traditions. Some of them are, local, zoning that is just, that's the way it's always been and we don't want to change. Some of it is, labor costs, materials, supply chain issues, lending challenges. There's so much at stake. I could talk to you for hours, but we're trying to get creative to break down the barriers to the production of affordable housing, and try to come up with some solutions that will improve the situation.
You have published an op-ed recently, Representative, on fair market rates, fair market rents. Talk about that, and how next year's fair market rents can impact housing affordability throughout. Talk about that. Describe what the challenges with fair market rents. People thinking that, okay, that's sufficient enough to tackle a problem like this, but you're saying that it's not.
Yeah, gosh, you might be the only person I've ever met that's read my op-ed, so I'm shocked. I think maybe some of my own family members read it if I'm lucky. But
you need to put that in the. We'll put it in the chat.
But yeah, no, I think we have such incredible disparities in Connecticut, and the fair market rent formula that sort of comes down from HUD and determines what is a 3-bedroom fair market rent in one zip code versus another. That's a complicated formula, but what it looks like on the ground in Connecticut is that if you are struggling economically and you actually somehow qualified for a Section 8 voucher, or we have a program called RAP in Connecticut, which is a little similar and a little different, but you can either get a RAP certificate or a Section 8 voucher. Actually, you haven't been able to get either for 7 years because there's been no opening to the wait list in either because of a lack of funding. But if you were fortunate to get one of these benefits, and fortunate is really the wrong word, but if you were able to get one of these benefits like 7 years ago, and you're trying to actually use it to find a safe, high quality place to live in Connecticut, what you're faced with is you can find a place in our urban centers and in zip codes that have that have certain outcomes. But if you're looking to use that housing benefit to live in a community that you might call a high opportunity community, maybe it's a community with a great public school, for example, you can't get in. The value of the voucher is so far below the actual market rate of what rents are in those communities. So what's essentially happening in Connecticut is the voucher program and the RAP certificates are eliminating housing choice for the intended recipients. They don't get to choose where they live. The value of the voucher or certificate forces people to live in high poverty, racially isolated communities. Now, in some cases, the recipient wants to live there. That's where they grew up. That's their home. That's their neighborhood. That's where they're proud. And they want to make a difference there. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to live in a certain neighborhood, but the program prevents people from making that own choice for themselves. And it's actually ironically and paradoxically actually in some ways increasing segregation and racial isolation in the state, which is ironic because it's a federal program funded by HUD whose mission is to affirmatively further fair housing, and it's paradoxically and tragically doing the opposite. And so, that's something that we have to be honest about, that even some of our, in some ways, great programs that are helping people avoid homelessness and housing instability, paradoxically are in some ways making other problems in the housing market worse by concentrating poverty and by concentrating racial and socioeconomic isolation in ways that I don't think were ever intended, but are just marketplace realities on the ground. I don't know if that made any sense to anybody.
I'm going to just those who are watching can submit questions in the chat room. You can start submitting questions in the chat room right now. Around the next 5 or 10 minutes, we'll start going through those questions and talking more about affordable housing as we talk about how states measure to improve affordable housing access. And so we're talking with Peggy Bailey, who's Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Also, she's recently worked, or she, in her former life, worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Also, you were hearing earlier on Delaware State Senator Russell Huxtable. He's a member of Delaware's Housing and Land Use Committee, and he's been working for a couple of decades on affordable housing issues. And just listening in to Connecticut State Representative Jeff Luxembourg, he is the chair of the Connecticut General Assembly's Housing Committee. I'm Charles Ellis, and I'm your moderator for today. So Peggy, I'll go back to you, and then we can kind of mix up the discussion a little bit. AMI. So I occasionally will have this discussion with experts in the housing field about AMI, or area median income, and looking at the way we typically measure that, and does it help, or does it in some ways hinder people when they're trying to access affordable housing? Is the housing being structured in a way that it meets AMI? It doesn't seem like that's happening.
Yeah, no, so Charles, yeah, so this is a great question, and it comes up a lot. And it's interesting because so as you can tell from my title, part of my life is in the housing space. Part of it is income, where I work on the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program and things like that. And I was just on a call the other day where folks who rely on the federal poverty level to meet certain requirements for programs were jealous of the AMI measure because it gets more at the local level than using FPL, or federal poverty level. So, obviously any of these metrics can have their issues. What I would say is the challenge kind of goes to what I was talking about before. We're only seeing the pie is so big so that we can only do certain things, because it isn't just about building housing to a specific AMI level, right? I mean, obviously the low income housing tax credit, you have to look at AMI to meet the federal requirements. But it's important to bring, but we only do that because we think we can't build all the housing that people need, and we know that there's not sufficient resources available for subsidies. So we try to only build housing targeted to specific AMI levels. When then, of course, we're going to leave people out. I think what is important is to shift how we think about housing development to be not just about single properties coming online, but how do we create a housing ecosystem that meets the needs of communities? So, for example, building one LIHTC building that's 100 units is great, but if a family with 3 kids, it doesn't have a unit that's big enough inside that LIHTC property, have we done the work in the single family rental space to protect affordable single family rentals for that family that's 2 parents with 3 kids who needs affordable rental housing, while also then thinking about the affordable single family purchasing space to make sure that there's a mix of that as well. I just think that in the housing space in particular, we've done ourselves a disservice by being so specific and in an industry focus without thinking about truly community and truly the housing ecosystem at large to be able to meet everyone's needs. Because right now, all we're doing is playing whack-a-mole, and we're not doing it very successfully.
Yeah, I don't know if Senator, Representative, you wanted to jump in on that AMI discussion and about, how helpful, how useful is that as a gauge on affordable housing?
Well, I'll take a little bit of it. It's the system that we've been working in for a really long time, and we have to realize that the state and and the federal government we don't have unlimited resources.
Mm.
So we need to figure a way to tailor those resources to where we believe may be a great need that will help. And if we address that particular need in that housing market, perhaps it'll relax other areas that were feeling the pinch too, because there weren't enough of a particular type of unit. So I think it's I can see where it's beneficial to kind of hone in where the resources go or who you're trying to target. But also, just to take a step back, I also think I could also say it's an awful idea because this AMIs are also used for hospital reimbursements and things of that nature. And it really impacts our rural communities to the detriment of those communities.
Gotcha. I don't know if Representative Luxembourg, if you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, we have an interesting intersection in Connecticut of AMI and SMI, where a lot of our affordable housing statutes give people depend the lesser of two or the greater of two. I didn't quite say that right. I'm sure my policy folks are cringing right now, but it's a very complex scheme, and in Fairfield County, particularly, where you have housing costs that are just through the roof. One bedroom apartment, a tiny 1-bedroom apartment might rent for $6,000 a month, and there's no affordability anywhere. It really, what the metric is can really make a difference at whether you're using AMI or SMI. So I don't know what I don't have like a better system or a better idea for how to measure income and then distribute resources, in an equitable way. I know it's not a perfect system, but I do agree with the other panelists about sort of taking a step back and viewing it in the context of the entire housing ecosystem. And so I guess I'll leave it at that.
One other touchy subject, right? But we have to unpack it more: zoning, right? And so what role could
huge issue here
states play, right, in zoning reform? Like, or typically when we think of zoning, right, we think of this as a city issue, as a local issue. But is there a role that states should be playing?
So I can start because I touched on this in my remarks, and I think that there is, mostly in like paving the way for communities to be able to then make local decisions about zoning. one of the things that we're seeing that's disturbing in some states, especially southern states, is preempting local communities' abilities to make zoning decisions in their own communities. Well, the reverse can be true as well, and that's what I think is the role for states, is to open up the opportunity for local governments to then have the ability to work to work broadly. I think also the other role in states is, in a state like in smaller states, the state can have a huge impact in unincorporated areas, because in states with county structures, being able to have the state lead in a way is also particularly important.
Senator, Representative. As far as have you all had any battles over zoning reform, or at least or have you have either one of your legislatures offered cities the ability to improve upon the way they zone for housing affordability?
I certainly think it's an area that is gaining more interest, as far as, not necessarily stepping on the toes of the local jurisdiction, but providing the tools for better planning and taking affordable housing in consideration in their land use maps. Because we had great cities and towns develop without the benefit of zoning. And I'm not saying like we just need to get rid of zoning, but sometimes zoning has created this issue because multifamily zoning has been traditionally frowned upon, that higher density, potentially lower cost housing, and where we tend, and I think Representative mentioned the NIMBY issue. You have people coming out shouting down any sort of density projects, and so then we end up with overabundance of single family homes at the higher end.
How do you, and real quick, I didn't mean to cut you off though, but since you mentioned that NIMBY issue, mentioned it once before in this conversation. So how do you deal with that though? How do you manage that resistance? NIMBY standing for those who are watching and don't understand or don't know, not too familiar with that term, not in my backyard. So and it's evolved. The way we've watched that term or its manifestation has evolved in so many different ways along racial lines, along class lines. We see it happening in terms of projects, housing projects, impact on the environment. So talk about that. How do we manage or deal with that kind of resistance, Senator?
Good question. It takes leadership. When I was, working for a nonprofit, I didn't mind the folks who were standing up and trying to shout down a project I was working on. It didn't really happen as much as I would have expected it to. But I just equate to I equate it to Sesame Street. These are the people living in our neighborhood. They need a place to live. This is, it's as simple as caring for our communities in that regard. But it's difficult when you're on the local level and you approve something that everyone hates, because the next election people are going to remind that county council person or the city person who's responsible for these local land use, and they could potentially get voted out for doing the right thing. And so I think there needs to be a better engagement between state, local, and counties to figure out how to get past the NIMBY issue and to address this a little bit more robustly, because we don't zone for multifamily very often, and because I think if we did, you'd have more people building it.
Go ahead, Representative Luxembourg. I see your head nodding.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in Connecticut, I think we need the state to have a more ambitious, aggressive approach as it relates to zoning, and to frankly have the zoning decisions be made with more state influence, as opposed to leaving it to local municipalities. That's a controversial thing to say, It's certainly controversial in Connecticut. It takes political courage, but there are interesting coalitions that have developed around the country where, I mean, the strangest of bedfellows, pro business, anti-regulation, anti-red tape Republicans team up with pro-housing Democrats, and they can agree on one thing. Let's not have onerous local zoning rules that are exclusionary, make it impossible to build all housing, including affordable housing, in communities. And so, I think there's an opportunity for some creative coalitions to be built around states taking a more proactive approach when it comes to zoning. But also, I think there also has to be sort of a historical context, right? This is really a civil rights issue. And I don't, it's, and correct me, anybody, if I'm wrong, but it's never been a local planning and zoning commission, in the history of our country or rarely has it been a local planning and zoning commission that has sort of taken the lead on saying this is a civil rights issue, not a local issue, right? And in fact, oftentimes it's been a local decision that's had to be overturned by a state government or a federal government when we've been dealing with really, really controversial but really, really important civil rights issues. To me, zoning falls into that category today as sort of a part of that battle, a part of that sort of legacy of the civil rights movement, a part of, like, when Dr. King talked about little girls and little boys playing together and being together, living together in communities, that was a dream. But that dream, why is that dream in some ways largely unrealized today in Connecticut and across the country? It's because state and federal government hasn't said inclusionary zoning and having diverse communities.
Discussion now. We're going to open up to
town by town works, So, anyways, I'll leave it there.
We're going to open up the floor now because I see we have a couple of questions, a couple of comments. I'm still going to ask questions. We are still in the throes of our housing affordability discussion, looking at how states measure it. And we're joined by Delaware State Senator Russell Huxtable, also Connecticut State Representative Jeff Luxembourg, and Peggy Bailey is the Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Please leave your questions. If you also have comments, you can leave those too. I'll read those out in the chat box feature here in our webinar. So you see that. You should be seeing that off to the right side of your screen. So I think I see like a couple of comments or questions. So I'm going to read those out loud and see if our panelists can jump in and address those. I see something from Sean Quitzow. Sean, do forgive me if I butchered your last name, but Quitzow, I think is how it's pronounced. And Sean here saying, it feels like one of the major issues right now is that landlords often have full discretion when it comes to rental rates. Are there federal or other levers that can be pulled to keep rent from ballooning unnecessarily? Who wants to jump in on that one?
So I can start. At the federal level, there aren't levers at this time around around rent increases and rent costs. The White House did put out some guidance or some sort of a wish list around tenants' rights, and I can find that and put that in the chat for folks. But one of the things I learned at HUD that I think I knew, but I didn't understand the implication of as much as I did when I was actually in the federal agency, is that HUD only has control over the things that Congress has given it authority to control, right? So HUD can control the Housing Choice Voucher Program. It can control any the CDBG program. It can control the things that it's been given by Congress. But most of the housing market is not under any authority for HUD, right? HUD can't even control low-income housing tax credit properties. That's the Department of Treasury and IRS. So there is, when we think about the federal government and how and what its reach is, actually in the housing space, the reach for the federal government isn't particularly deep when you think about how large the housing market is. It's in different silos in different ways. From states, there are some states that have started to explore rent increased caps, and there are an increasing number of localities. So it's similar to zoning. It's another place where there are local governments that are starting to make experiment with ways to say, okay, well, landlords, you can only increase rents by 3% or by 1% plus inflation rates or something like that, to try to start to provide some constraints. But it's not widespread, to say the least.
Yeah, Senator, Representative, what can state legislatures do as far as landlord discretion over rental rates? And then I'm seeing like a recent move by not necessarily a state, right? They operate as a city state, but I know in the District of Columbia's Attorney General recently suing what it called a sort of a cabal of landlords, of property managers, saying that they were unfairly setting rental rates. Which was very interesting, and sort of you're starting to see this move taking foot in other places as well, other cities. It was interesting how the Attorney General in the District of Columbia framed these landlords, these big corporate property managers, the way that they were colluding. Is that something that state legislatures are looking at?
I think so. I've been embarking on this affordable housing listening tour in the state of Delaware over the last month, and we've got a couple more sessions to go. And this has been brought up a couple times. Like, why can't there be like a public service commission and add housing into that? We have it for electric rates, water rates, sewer rates, things of that nature. But why not housing in general? And we do have some rent controls in manufactured housing. And coincidentally, Delaware just released our housing needs assessment. And for every level of market, our single family, our apartments, our townhouses, everything is kind of relatively stayed the same. We haven't seen like a big increase in rents in multifamily compared to, so it's been a pretty stable market. With the exception of manufactured housing. We saw a decrease of 6,000 units. And so I think you sometimes have to be concerned with, if you do over regulate, then you're not going to have anybody who will operate. And if we have a supply issue, that's going to force developers into other areas where they don't have the same controls. So it's a balancing act, and there's going to be a lot of stakeholders that will need to be engaged, I think, in the conversation before that before I'm ready to go into that direction.
Yeah. Oh, Representative, go ahead.
Yeah, I just finished my first year chairing the housing committee in Connecticut, and we did put a bunch of tenant protections in place that had been worked on for many years. And I think my colleague here in Delaware kind of alluded to the tension, right? There's also a tension about, how are you protecting people from rent increases today and the pain they're feeling today, while also keeping an eye on the ball long term to ease the burden. And it's clear long term, to ease the burden, we have to build more housing, including deed restricted affordable housing. But at the same time, if people are so rent burdened and they can't survive today because of because not just of the supply demand issues, but also because of predatory landlord practices that are sort of given extra oxygen by the marketplace. They're in the driver's seat even more. The power imbalance that's inherent in a landlord-tenant arrangement is exaggerated in a housing crisis like this. So we have to be sensitive to putting protections in place and trying to figure out ways to help people with their pain right now. And I think sometimes there's a tension between those two things. So it's an interesting policy dilemma for every state to grapple with.
Can I add one thing to this?
Go ahead. Sure, Senator.
So the state of Delaware did pass the right to representation this year, which will really help those folks who may be taking advantage of. So that should help in the short term. So there are things we can do immediately to address those things. Yeah.
One thing that I was recently made aware of, speaking about that supply demand issue you just mentioned, Representative, we're knowing or learning, for those in the audience who don't know, rates of housing production, housing construction are lower now in 2023 than before 2008. So we have this housing supply issue, while at the same time we've got worsening income inequality in the United States. A lot of that defined, of course, by race, and record number of households with what are called worst case needs. So, we have this supply demand issue, low levels of housing supply, higher demand, of course, demographics changing all over the place. So what do we do about that? Like, how do we resolve like that supply demand issue, and then also that income inequality issue at the same time? How do we reconcile that? Because then you have workers with incomes that are too low to sustain those types of median home prices and rents. Like in states now, we have median, or we have the median price of a home averaging at like what is like $1 million. So while at the same time people's incomes aren't keeping up with that, as Peggy Bailey was showing earlier. So how do we resolve that construction issue?
Yeah, I'll take a first stab at it. If folks can hear me okay, hopefully I'm coming through all right. So we have a sort of a creative idea in Connecticut to create a rental savings account modeled after the HSA at the federal level, which has been so successful, which is just to start to reimagine how every part of our tax code, every piece at every level of government, is currently geared towards incentivizing not just home ownership, but also investment in real estate, and how almost none of our tax code or economic policy is geared towards helping a person that's a renter or a tenant. So part of it is sort of acknowledging that there's a structural inequity in our tax code that needs to be reimagined. I mean, we're now in an economy where a lot of people want to rent, and yet our tax code is sort of antiquated, that it's built on this notion that everybody wants to own a home, and everybody will own a home, and everybody someday can afford to own a home. And that's just not really where society is. So part of it is reimagining our tax code to deal with the cost burden and actually alleviate costs for renters. But the other piece is we have to make more affordable housing production actually pencil out for developers. And it's an uncomfortable conversation, maybe even for some of us that are Democrats that may worry about the optics of that. But the reality is the government isn't building the vast majority of housing. Something like 99% of housing is being built in the private marketplace. And either that private marketplace decision is going to pencil out for the developer to actually build deed restricted affordable units, or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, as progressive of a Democrat as I may be, I can't realistically expect a business person who either shares my values or doesn't to go embark on some business venture that doesn't mathematically work for him or her. So I think speaking a little bit here to Democrats, we have to really look at what pencils out and what doesn't. And the things that cause the production of affordable housing to not pencil out, we have to redo. So whether that's over-regulation, whether that's exclusionary zoning at the local level, whether that's court processes that take too long, whether that's materials that go into building being overtaxed, whether it's the cost of lending and no low interest loan options for developers, whatever the barriers are, we've got to be willing to go deep and unravel them. That's my view.
Mm-hmm. One thing we didn't mention, so many questions here too, and it sounds like we're going to have a part 2 at some later point, but we still have about 5 minutes here. COVID-19, the pandemic, what did we learn from that experience, and the relationship between public health and housing affordability, housing stability? Anyone want to jump in on that? Peggy, Senator Huxtable?
Sure, I can.
We have you, Peggy? Peggy, you're on
You're
mute.
on mute.
Oh, sorry. Thanks. No, luckily, all I was saying is that I was putting in the chat an article that I refer to a lot regarding the representative's point about how expensive and hard it is to build affordable housing that Ezra Klein wrote about, featuring Los Angeles, but the story he tells is a universal story of how hard it is to put together the capital resources, and how we just need to kind of rethink that, because we're just making it harder to build something that we want to make easier. But so on the pandemic, we learned a lot, and are still, because states are still using their state and local relief fund dollars, and that back in 25% of their emergency rental assistance dollars on housing supply. So we are learning a lot about and I think the senator mentioned in Delaware ways that they're using their American Rescue Plan dollars in the affordable housing space. So it's not still past tense yet with pandemic relief dollars. We're starting to, this is still present tense of how states and localities can use their state and local relief dollars in the housing space. So one is to ease the capital stack and provide free money to developers to incentivize them to develop affordable housing and fill in the gaps that LIHTC developers see that they need to be filled quickly. And then the other pieces are, from a renter standpoint, the emergency rental assistance program helps set up structures to deal with crisis interventions, and states and localities are keeping that in place. And then housing authorities still, for the most part, still have emergency housing vouchers that they can use for people at risk of or experiencing homelessness or survivors of domestic violence, to house them quickly as well. And the cool thing about these is that all of these things is that the legislation passed so quickly that there aren't a lot of constraints. So communities so states, localities, and housing authorities have a lot of flexibility in experimenting with new and more efficient ways to deliver those resources. So and folks like the Urban Institute and others are studying that, so that we can start to apply those same lessons to the more rigid programs that have been more longstanding.
Yeah, Representative, Senator, lessons that you learned from the pandemic, from COVID-19, in terms of housing, affordability, availability, stability. What did we learn at that intersection of public health and housing?
I defer to the senator to go first.
Working for a nonprofit during that time, we saw barriers being broken down between the housing and health folks, and learning to work together on these issues. So I think that was a benefit that came out of it, the collaboration amongst industries that had normally been siloed, them coming together. And that flood of capital that came in, I hope it is going to be used creatively. My concern is, and this is a quote from Einstein, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. And so my feeling is we got this gift, and then we're going to put all these restrictions in place, and that's not going to be beneficial to the overall market. So hoping that we'll have a mindset change there.
So I'm going to just take like one more minute here. Moderator's privilege is to take one more minute here. So after this discussion, kind of, has it made you think a little bit differently in terms of steps moving forward? Like where do we go next? I'll go around the table. real quick, because I'm just going to take a couple more minutes. Peggy?
Well, one, it's really exciting to see so much synergy between what we were all saying. So that's great. We didn't plan that. And two is the recognition that we all have that the market by itself isn't sufficient, and that there is a role for policymakers to play to correct for that for people with the lowest incomes.
Go ahead, Senator.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation, and I think what we need to build from this is I now want to reach out to the representative to get some more ideas about the rental savings account. So we are not in this alone, and so we need to rely on other folks who have tried and failed with other policies to figure out what we can do. Because I firmly believe we stand on the shoulder of giants, and we build upon other people's successes and model it for our own states and our own jurisdictions.
Representative?
Well, thank you for having me, and sorry for being late as well. I think housing is health. And you see that if you simply look at the life expectancy of a person experiencing homelessness, living into their 50s in the United States, and everyone else living into their 80s, right? The foundation of all healthcare, even frankly, education, all the other issues that are so important to everybody. The foundation is housing. If you stabilize people's housing first, everything else, you get better outcomes at a lower cost. And so I think part of what we have to do together is figure out the policies that creatively allow us to use that housing first model that our friends in the nonprofit sector have understood and been asking us to do for many years, but government maybe hasn't been so responsive. And so I think, the pandemic, maybe more than anything, showed us where those vulnerabilities were. And I hope we seize the moment and make a difference moving forward.
All right. I will let Connecticut State Representative Jeff Luxembourg have the last word on that. Also before him, Delaware State Senator Russell Huxtable. And before him, it was Peggy Bailey. Peggy Bailey also offering us a presentation in the beginning of this discussion. She's the Vice President for Housing and Income Security at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. Everyone with deep and immersive expertise in housing. So I feel like we just need to have a fresh part 2 discussion at some later point. So we will do that, I'm sure, here at the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Conference. We have been hosting this conversation on housing affordability and how states are measuring it, what states are doing about it, the role that states are playing. So we have been looking at this issue constantly here at the Council of State Governments. For more information on us, you can go to CSG-ERC.org. Of course, want to also congratulate my colleague. He's actually in the room with me. We are coming at you live from the Maryland General Assembly from Annapolis, from the Maryland State Capitol. We're here talking with our state legislators here in Maryland who are part of our region. So Joseph Shivitz, who's our new, congratulations. This is your first virtual panel that he put together, that he facilitated. So fantastic job pulling this together. Also Dylan McDowell, our communications director, also here in the conference room with us, joining me as well. And David Biet, our executive director with CSG East, also in here. So we've got we're told that we have a couple of people who are just down the street from us. So, but we're here in the state capitol in Annapolis. So I definitely want to give a shout out and a thank you to the Maryland General Assembly for providing us with this room as we've carried out this presentation, this conversation today. So, and in fact, just real quick, stay in tune for the big annual meeting, the Council of State Governments Eastern Regional Annual Meeting that will be taking place in Maryland, in Baltimore next year, in July 2024. So more information at csg-erc.org. Senator Huxtable, Representative Luxembourg, Peggy, I hope to see you there as well. I'm Charles Ellison, by the way. I'm the director for the Council on Communities of Color at CSG Eastern Region, and you can definitely find me at csg-erc.org or just go on LinkedIn. All right, Everyone have a fantastic rest of your afternoon and fantastic weekend. Hope to see you all soon. Take care. Thank you.